Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who thought they could intimidate, trap, or bulldoze their way through life and learned that actions have consequences. One involves a road rage coward who screamed at the wrong woman, and another a parking spot stalker who trapped herself. Here we go. My boyfriend is a cop, the bluff that sent a road rage coward fleeing through a red light. This happened about 25 years ago, back when returning a movie on time actually mattered. Blockbuster was still king, and if you didn't get your VHS tapes back by closing time on the due date, you were looking at late fees that felt criminal. It was 9:50 p.m. on the night my rentals were due, and I had that sudden bolt of panic when you realize you have exactly 10 minutes to avoid being charged extra for forgetting to rewind. I grabbed the tapes, my keys, and practically jogged to my car. The Blockbuster was on a short commercial strip surrounded by mostly residential streets. By that time of night, most of the businesses were closed and the street was nearly deserted. Parking was abundant. There were no crowds, no traffic jams, no chaos. I returned the videos with 2 minutes to spare, feeling smugly victorious, and headed back to my car. Since my house was in the opposite direction from the way I'd approached, I checked both sides of the road carefully and made a U-turn. There were no headlights coming, no cars parked with engines running. I was absolutely certain the street was empty when I turned out. As I straightened out, I noticed headlights suddenly behind me. I genuinely have no idea where that car came from. It wasn't there seconds earlier. I figured maybe it had pulled out from a dark side street or had its lights off and then turned them on. Whatever the case, I shrugged it off and continued driving. I stopped at the first stop sign. The car stopped behind me. Nothing unusual. At the next block, I noticed his headlights flicker slightly. Sometimes that happens when someone hits a bump, so I didn't think much of it. We stopped at a traffic light, still no other cars around, and he remained directly behind me. The light turned green, and I continued forward at a normal speed. His lights flashed again. I started wondering if something was wrong with my car. Was I dragging something? Was one of my brake lights out? If he wanted to pass, he could have easily gone around me. The road was wide open. At the next stop sign, he suddenly roared up alongside me on my right. Before I could even process what was happening, he leaned out his window and shouted, "Effing B!" Then he made a sharp right turn and sped off down that street. I just sat there for a second in stunned silence. I replayed the U-turn in my head. I'd checked both directions. I hadn't cut anyone off. I hadn't braked suddenly or done anything aggressive. I couldn't figure out where he'd even come from. Maybe he'd been parked with his lights off. Maybe he'd gunned it from the far end of the block. To this day, I have no idea. In that moment, I had a choice. I could drive straight home, which was one more block ahead, lock my door and forget about it, or I could turn right and follow him. I caught a glimpse of him when he yelled. He was a dumpy, overweight white guy in his 40s, the kind of man who feels bold behind a windshield but would probably avoid eye contact in person. My gut told me he would never have said that to a man. He said it because I was a woman alone in a car. I turned right. He picked the wrong woman to scream at. He thought you'd just go home and feel small. Instead, you memorized his plate and followed. That's not what cowards expect. The next intersection was a major one with a full traffic light and 3 lanes in each direction. He was stopped at a red light. I pulled up behind him and took a second to memorize his license plate. I repeated it in my head twice. Then I moved into the left lane, pulled up alongside him, and rolled down my passenger window. He looked over at me with a smug, contemptuous grin. I leaned slightly toward his window and said very clearly, "What did you call me?" He didn't hesitate. "You heard me." "Why would you say something like that?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "You cut me off back there," he snapped. That was a lie, and he knew it. I checked for cars. There hadn't been any. But instead of arguing about the traffic details, I decided to escalate in a different direction. "My boyfriend's a cop," I said calmly. He snorted. "Yeah, whatever. Have him call me." Without breaking eye contact, I slowly and clearly recited his license plate number back to him. Every letter, every number. Deliberate and unmistakable. Then I said, "He's not going to call you. He and his partner are going to visit you." For the first time, the smugness cracked. His expression shifted from dismissive to alarmed. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was the late 90s. You didn't just shrug off the idea of police showing up at your door. What he did next was reckless and frankly pathetic. He gunned his engine and blasted straight through the red light to escape me. For a split second, I thought he was going to get T-boned by cross traffic, but somehow he made it through untouched. He disappeared down the road like a startled animal. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, then burst out laughing. I didn't even have a boyfriend at the time. There was no cop waiting to avenge my honor. It was a pure bluff. I drove home slowly, adrenaline buzzing in my veins. Over the next few nights, I entertained myself, imagining him lying awake, replaying the encounter, wondering if two officers were going to knock on his door, checking every passing car outside his house, maybe even telling himself he hadn't really said anything that bad while simultaneously dreading consequences. He'd chosen to shout an insult at a stranger because he believed he could do it without repercussions. The moment he thought there might be accountability, he fled through a red light. I never saw him again, but I like to think that the next time he felt the urge to scream something vile at a random woman from the safety of his car, he remembered how quickly his confidence evaporated at a recited license plate. If nothing else, I hoped he hesitated. And if he hesitated, that's enough for me. You didn't need a cop boyfriend, you just needed him to believe you had one. That license plate's still burned in his brain somewhere. He probably checks his mirrors more now, all because you refused to just drive home and cry. And our second story. She wanted our parking spot so badly she blocked us from leaving, so I gave it back to her and went for a stroll. A few months ago, my wife and I took our two kids to the local mall on a Saturday afternoon. It wasn't anything special, just one of those routine trips where you tell yourself you'll only grab a couple of things and somehow end up walking half the building. By the time we made it back to the car, we were tired. The kids were restless, and we were mentally halfway to lunch. The parking lot was busy, but not chaotic, just the usual slow crawl of cars circling for spots. As we approached our car, I noticed a vehicle idling a short distance behind it, but I didn't think much of it. I focused on buckling our youngest into his car seat while asking my oldest what he wanted for lunch. He was deeply invested in whether pizza counted as healthy if you get vegetables on it, and we were mid-debate when I heard a sharp honk. I glanced up briefly but didn't connect it to us. The honking came again, longer this time. My wife looked over her shoulder and said quietly, "I think she wants our spot, her blinkers on." I turned and saw a woman in an SUV staring at us with that intense, expectant look of someone who has already mentally claimed your parking space. I shrugged and kept fastening the last buckle. We weren't dawdling, but we weren't sprinting either. We had two small kids to secure, and that takes a minute. The honking escalated. Not quick taps, but full impatient blasts. It wasn't like we were unloading a moving truck. It had been maybe 2 minutes. I felt my jaw tighten, but I told myself to ignore it. "Relax," I muttered under my breath as I shut the car door and walked around to the driver's side. My wife got in on her side, shaking her head. "She's really laying on the horn," she said. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and prepared to back out. "Screw it, I'm leaving," I said. The woman had inched her SUV forward while we were loading the kids, positioning herself close behind us to make sure nobody else could swoop in and take her spot. The problem was that she'd pulled up so tight to my rear bumper that I didn't have room to maneuver. I put the car in reverse and eased back carefully, only to realize I couldn't turn out of the space because her front end was practically kissing my trunk. I pulled forward slightly, then tried again. She responded by inching closer. I stopped and looked at my wife. "I literally can't get out," I said. "She's too close." The honking resumed, shorter and sharper now, like she was urging me to hurry up while simultaneously blocking my exit. I rolled down my window slightly and gestured for her to back up a bit. She just waved her hand dismissively, like I was the one causing the problem. At this point, about 5 minutes had passed since we first got to the car. I took a deep breath and leaned back in my seat. "You know what?" I said to my wife. "In the time she spent honking at us, she could have found another spot. If she doesn't want to give me the space to leave, I'll make sure she has to look elsewhere." My wife looked at me sideways, half amused, half exasperated. "You're not going to," she started, but she knew me well enough to stop. I shifted the car back into drive and pulled forward into the parking spot again, straightening out as if I had just arrived. Then I turned off the engine. The honking stopped abruptly. I opened my door calmly and stepped out, closing it behind me. The woman's face went from annoyed to incredulous in seconds. I walked toward the mall entrance at a casual pace, as if I'd forgotten something important inside. Behind me, I heard her engine rev slightly, then she sped off in frustration, tires squealing just enough to draw a few glances from nearby pedestrians. She had clearly decided that waiting any longer was a waste of time. I counted to 3 in my head, turned around, and walked straight back to my car. My wife was laughing now, shaking her head. "You are ridiculous," she said as I got back in and started the engine again. This time there was no SUV glued to my bumper. The space behind us was wide open. I reversed smoothly, turned out of the spot without issue, and drove off toward the exit. As we passed the end of the row, I spotted the same SUV halfway down the aisle, crawling along in search of another space. The driver's blinker was still on, like a sad little beacon of impatience. I didn't honk, I didn't wave. I just kept driving. She spent all that energy honking, blocking, and chasing you out. Now she's still circling the lot with her blinker on, and you're already on your way home. The only thing she accomplished was wasting her own time. On the way home, my oldest asked why we had stopped and then started again. I told him sometimes people need a reminder that being patient works better than being rude. My wife smirked and said, "Or sometimes your dad just likes to prove a point." Both were probably true. I'm not claiming it was noble. It was petty, plain and simple. But if you're going to trap someone in a parking spot while leaning on your horn, don't be surprised when they decide you can wait a little longer. The mall has plenty of spaces. Courtesy, apparently, was the only thing in short supply that day. And our last story. Karen tried to demolish my kid's treehouse. I watched it live, called 911, and enjoyed the show. My daughter turned 6 last spring, and I decided that instead of buying another pile of plastic toys that would end up forgotten in a closet, I would build her something that felt permanent. We have a massive old oak tree in the backyard, the kind that looks like it has stories to tell, and I figured it deserved a little architecture. I spent a couple of weekends building a sturdy platform with railings, a small sloped roof, and a rope ladder she could pull up when she wanted to feel like royalty guarding her kingdom. It wasn't elaborate, but it was solid, safe, and built with a ridiculous amount of fatherly pride. She helped me paint it pink and purple, and when we were done, she declared it the best castle in the whole world. For about 2 peaceful weeks, it was exactly that. She held tea parties up there with stuffed animals, waved at squirrels like they were visiting dignitaries, and occasionally announced that dragons were circling the yard. Then Carol showed up. Carol lives 3 streets over and considers herself the spiritual embodiment of the HOA. The catch is that we are not part of the HOA. Our section of the neighborhood predates it, and years ago the homeowners here collectively opted out. Carol, however, has never let inconvenient details interfere with her sense of authority. She appeared at my door one Saturday morning with a clipboard tucked under her arm and the expression of someone who had come to issue a citation. "There's been a complaint about a structure in your backyard," she announced without greeting. I asked her what structure she was referring to, already knowing the answer. "The treehouse," she said, leaning to look past me as if expecting to see a missile silo. "It's above the fence line. That's a lookout tower. It violates neighborhood aesthetic standards and poses a security risk." I honestly thought she was joking. "It's a treehouse," I replied, "for my 6-year-old. Carol did not blink. "From that height, she can see into other yards," she said gravely. "That's an invasion of privacy." I told her my daughter was mostly interested in spotting squirrels and imaginary dragons, not conducting surveillance operations. Carol's jaw tightened. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA board," she declared. I reminded her we weren't members. She paused for half a second, then said, "You should be, and you'll follow the rules anyway." That's who she is. You told her you weren't in the HOA. She heard you should be, and I'll enforce it anyway. Rules don't matter to people like that. Only control does. 2 days later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of my house. I walked out to meet the officer, already guessing who had made the call. He was a young guy trying very hard not to smile. "Sir, we received a report of a suspicious elevated structure potentially being used for criminal observation," he read carefully from his notes. I pointed to the pink and purple treehouse where my daughter was currently hosting a tea party for 2 stuffed bears and a plastic dinosaur. The officer looked at it, looked back at me, and sighed. "That's gonna be a nothing," he said. "Sorry to bother you." The caller was persistent. I asked if her name was Carol. He nodded. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, while I was at work, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera I'd installed after Carol's first visit. I opened the app and felt my stomach drop. There was Carol inside my fenced backyard holding a handsaw. Next to her stood a man I'd never seen before gripping a sledgehammer. They were pacing around the treehouse like they were planning a demolition. My hand started shaking as I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher that 2 people were trespassing and attempting to destroy my property in real time. I stayed on the line watching through the camera as Carol pointed at the support beams and barked instructions. The man lifted the sledgehammer and tested its weight. I yelled uselessly at my phone knowing they couldn't hear me. "The police are on their way," I muttered, hoping it was true. Apparently, the distant sound of sirens carried through the neighborhood because Carol suddenly froze and turned toward the gate. 2 squad cars rolled up, blocking her minivan in the driveway. The man dropped the sledgehammer immediately and raised his hands. Carol began talking at a mile a minute, waving her clipboard and gesturing toward the treehouse as if it were evidence in a federal case. The officers were unimpressed. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs in my backyard, still arguing about bylaws and community standards. I arrived home just as they were placing her in the back of the cruiser. One officer met me at the gate. "Sir, do you wish to press charges for trespassing and attempted vandalism?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Carol was still shouting through the window, "It's a watchtower! I have the right to protect this neighborhood!" The officer shut the door mid-sentence. It turned out the man with the sledgehammer was her nephew, a handyman she'd convinced that I'd given permission to dismantle an abandoned eyesore. He looked mortified and cooperated fully, giving a statement that made it clear he'd been misled. He was released with a warning. Carol, on the other hand, spent the night in jail. The actual HOA board issued a public clarification that I was not a member and that Carol had no official position whatsoever. Once the story hit the neighborhood Facebook page, it snowballed. Neighbors began sharing their own run-ins with her, from threatening letters about lawn height to complaints about holiday decorations. Someone posted a photo of the police cars outside my house with the caption, "The Watchtower Strikes Back." It wasn't subtle, but it was satisfying. For the first time, Carol wasn't the one controlling the narrative. 6 months later, her house went up for sale. The sign sat there longer than usual, and more than once I saw prospective buyers pause to glance at the bright treehouse in my yard. I made a point of waving cheerfully from my deck. My daughter still climbs up there every afternoon when the weather's good. Sometimes she announces she's guarding her kingdom from dragons. Other times, with a mischievous grin, she says she's watching for clipboards. 3 different battles, 3 different victories. Story 1 was the power of a bluff. A man screamed an insult from his car, confident he'd never face consequences. Then a woman memorized his plate, recited it back, and mentioned her cop boyfriend. He ran a red light to escape. No boyfriend existed, no charges were filed, but somewhere out there a middle-aged man still checks his rearview mirror twice. Story 2 was the art of patience. A woman honked, blocked, and trapped a family in their parking spot. They could have argued. Instead, they pulled back in, got out, and went for a walk. She sped off in frustration, still searching for a space. They drove home 5 minutes later. She spent 10 more minutes circling. That's not revenge, that's just math. But story 3 wins. Carol escalated from clipboard complaints to breaking and entering with a sledgehammer. She brought a nephew, she got caught on camera, she spent a night in jail. The HOA publicly disavowed her. Her house went up for sale. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.